If you don't return to the rear cabin immediately, I'll have airport security remove you." The flight attendant, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes, snarled as he grabbed Elias's forearm, trying to pull him from seat 3A with a force that implied he was trespassing. Elias didn't struggle, didn't offer a defense. He simply took out his phone, unlocked it with a glance, and said, "Lock it down." The older man beside him, impeccably dressed, let out a disdainful sigh. "I told you his kind don't belong in first class," he muttered, before handing the attendant a folded $100 bill with a triumphant smirk. Across the aisle, a young woman's hand trembled. Someone else discreetly started recording. Boarding came to a sudden halt. He hadn't even stated his name. The attendant forced a laugh, pocketing the cash. "But people like Elias Vance don't need to. You're watching Silent Sovereigns. Tell us your city and state. Like, subscribe, and stay with us." The automatic doors to the jet bridge slid shut behind Elias as he boarded transnational Flight 812 out of Chicago O'Hare. It was late afternoon, the hour when the airport's frantic energy began to fray at the edges. He walked with a quiet confidence, his dark gray suit tailored to perfection over a simple black t-shirt. Leather Oxford shoes made almost no sound on the worn carpeting. In his right hand, a slim, carbon fiber briefcase was held with a steady grip. As he reached the plane's entrance, a younger attendant offered a practiced, welcoming smile. With a soft beep from the scanner, Elias offered a slight nod and crossed into the aircraft. The cabin carried the scent of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. A low-volume pop song drifted from the speakers. The first-class cabin was nearly full. The atmosphere here felt pressurized, heavy with self-importance. Elias found his seat, 3A, stowed the briefcase under the seat in front, and settled into the plush leather. He let out a slow, deliberate breath, centering himself. Across the aisle, a man in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Elias's first car, raised a quizzical eyebrow. Arthur Sterling. His glance was a familiar one, a quick, dismissive appraisal that cataloged attire before anything else. Elias recognized the look, but gave no reaction. He simply smoothed the sleeve of his jacket. Sterling cleared his throat, his voice loud enough to carry. "Surprised they're still handing out last-minute upgrades on these cross-country flights." Elias turned his gaze toward him. "Pardon me?" Sterling offered a condescending smile. "Are you traveling for work? Or did you just get lucky with the seating lottery today?" Before Elias could formulate a reply, another voice joined them. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." A flight attendant had materialized beside them. He was in his early 40s, with meticulously coiffed blonde hair and a name tag that read, Greg. He focused his attention on Sterling first, his posture deferential. "Mr. Sterling, it's an honor to have you with us again. Champagne or your usual scotch before we push back?" Sterling beamed. "Let's begin with the champagne. We'll move to the scotch once we're in the air." Greg nodded, then his gaze shifted to Elias. His warm demeanor cooled, the smile becoming a thin, professional line. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass one more time?" Elias handed it over without a word. Greg gave it a cursory look, his eyes barely registering the details. "I see," he muttered, his brow furrowed. "Seat 3A. Are you certain you're on the right aircraft?" "I am," Elias stated, his voice calm but unyielding. Greg held the pass for another moment before returning it. "Just running a final check. Enjoy your trip." He walked off, but the air remained thick with unspoken tension. Sterling leaned in conspiratorially. Don't mind him. We just value a certain decorum in this cabin. Elias offered a smile devoid of warmth. That's ironic. I was just thinking the very same thing. Sterling huffed and rustled his copy of the Wall Street Journal. A few minutes later, Greg was back, his expression now a tight mask of concern. He knelt beside Elias, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Sir, there appears to be a booking conflict with your seat. Our system is showing it as unverified. Would you please step to the economy cabin while we resolve this? Elias met his gaze directly. No. Greg's eyes widened. Excuse me? I said no. This seat is mine. If you have a system error, your team at the gate can handle it. I am not moving. Nearby, heads began to turn. A woman put down her magazine. A man paused his phone call. Greg's face hardened. Sir, I must insist. Then you can insist to your superiors, Elias replied, his voice never rising. Sterling put down his paper with dramatic slowness. Really, there's no reason to cause a scene for everyone. Greg glanced at Sterling, and something in his resolve shifted. He stood up, his professional demeanor evaporating. He reached down, grabbing Elias's wrist and tugging him forcefully from the chair. Sir, you are creating a disturbance. If you do not move at this instant, I will have security escort you from this aircraft. Elias stumbled, but remained composed. First class was now completely silent. Sterling let out a low chuckle. About time. He then took a crisp bill, a $100 from his wallet, and slipped it into Greg's hand. Thank you for maintaining a certain standard. Greg took the money without looking away from Elias. Elias straightened his jacket, took out his phone and tapped the screen once. No drama, just 3 words spoken into the charged silence with chilling clarity. Initiate system-wide lockdown. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The stale, recycled air in the first-class cabin grew heavy, pressing down like an impending thunderstorm. Elias stood unflinchingly in the aisle, calmly adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket as if he hadn't just been assaulted. No one knew what the phrase meant. No one dared to ask, except for Sterling. Is that it? He sneered, sipping his champagne. Greg's triumphant expression began to falter. The feeling of being in control was rapidly slipping away. He glanced toward the cockpit, waiting for some kind of support, but a series of soft electronic chimes echoed through the cabin instead. Near the cabin door, a small, previously unnoticed red light began to flash rhythmically. At the gate, an agent's handheld device buzzed violently. What the? She whispered, looking up in confusion. Hold all boarding procedures. We have a confirmed red tier flag from corporate. Her colleague's eyes widened. For which flight? She stared at her screen. 812. It's happening right now. Behind her, the heavy gate door began to hiss shut. Inside the plane, a woman in 4B looked up, her brow furrowed. Why are they sealing the door? We're not finished boarding. 2 rows back, a young man held his phone steady. The video had started the moment Greg had laid hands on Elias. His thumb hovered over the post button. What was that noise? Another passenger whispered. A baby somewhere in the rear of the plane started to wail. Greg reached for the intercom, but it buzzed to life before his fingers could touch it. A message appeared on the small digital screen. Do not engage with passenger in 3A. He stared, dumbfounded. A second message followed. FAA override activated. Flight system is now in lockdown. Greg stepped back from Elias, who remained silent and motionless. He stood like a man carved from stone, his gaze calm and unreadable. The phone had already vanished into his pocket. Sterling sensed the dramatic shift. He lowered his glass. What in God's name is happening? No one answered. In the cockpit, the captain's headset crackled with an urgent message. He listened, his face paling. Repeat that? A ground hold, but we're fully boarded. The voice on the other end was cold and official. Code Black, Captain. Flight 8112 is frozen. Do not move from the gate. Do not taxi. Await instruction from federal authorities. He looked at his first officer, who was already powering down the pre-flight sequence. Murmurs rippled through the cabin as the lights flickered, and the air circulation system whirred down to a near stop. Elias finally stepped back toward his seat, moving with a fluid grace that defied the tension in the air. He sat down, as if nothing had occurred. Sterling stared at him, bewildered. What did you do? Who are you? Elias didn't answer. He simply adjusted the crease in his trousers, crossed his legs, and gazed out the small oval window. The phone in row 5 buzzed. The video was live. Title: Summit Air Attendant Assaults Black Man in First Class. Then this happened. Within 3 minutes, it had over 5,000 views. The first major tremor didn't occur on the plane, but at gate C-12. The gate agents stared at their tablets as the usual blue boarding screens were replaced with stark red text. Priority halt. Federal lockdown in progress. It didn't specify FAA or DHS. It didn't need to. Airport security personnel near the gate straightened up. One, an ex-military man, reflexively took a step forward, creating a silent barrier between the terminal and the jet bridge. We've been grounded hard, he muttered. Terrorist threat? Another asked. Something else. 10 gates away, in a nondescript operations center behind a coffee kiosk, Summit Air Supervisor. Maria Flores's tablet chimed 3 times. She picked it up just as her personal phone lit up with a text from a secure Summit Air number designated Level 7 Override. The message was brief. Flight 812 locked. Passenger override confirmed. FAA Code Black in effect. Do not allow pushback. Maria spun around to her lead coordinator. Get me the live feed from the flight deck now! Seconds later, every monitor in the room showed a frozen image from an internal cabin camera. A still of Elias being hauled out of his seat by Greg, his wrist bent at an unnatural angle, his expression unreadable. When did this happen? 4 minutes ago. Who filmed it? Not our system. Public video is already circulating. It's on every platform. Maria clenched her jaw. Her eyes scanned another screen displaying the video, now titled, They Dragged Him from First Class, Then He Froze the Plane. It had hit 50,000 views and was accelerating. She pulled up the internal Summit Air passenger manifest. There must be a glitch. But there wasn't. 3A, Vance, Elias, Flag, Sentinel List, Tier 0. Maria's blood ran cold. The Sentinel List was not for public knowledge. It wasn't even accessible on standard FAA systems. Only a handful of top-level executives knew of its existence. Names on the Sentinel List were not just VIPs. They were untouchable. Crossing them was not just a mistake. It was an act of corporate suicide. She looked around the control room. Lock down every gate within a 300-foot radius of C-12. Nothing moves. Not until we get federal clearance. Someone behind her whispered, "Who is that guy?" Maria didn't have an answer. Across the country, in Summit Air's Atlanta headquarters, the emergency phone rang. Chief Executive Officer David Chen answered it himself. "This is Chen." "You have a significant problem," said a calm, female voice on the other end. It was devoid of emotion. "Who is this?" "That's not important. Your Flight 812 has just initiated a code black. It's an FAA override from a passenger in seat 3A. Chen frowned. "That flight hasn't even left the gate. A code black is reserved for in-flight emergencies. Not when the override is triggered by someone with foundational access to the system. Someone with federal infrastructure credentials." Chen turned to his deputy. "Pull up the cabin security footage. Right now." His monitor flickered to life, showing Greg manhandling a passenger. What in the hell was he thinking? The voice on the phone continued. "I suggest you contact your legal team, because as of 5 minutes ago, Summit Air is officially under a comprehensive review." "By who? The FAA? Homeland Security?" A pause. "Nexus Oversight." Chen's voice dropped. My God. Back on the plane, Elias sat still, unflappable. He hadn't uttered a word since he resumed his seat, but every system around him was in a state of controlled collapse. The captain's voice came over the intercom, strained and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an unforeseen procedural delay. Please stay in your seats as we await further information." Sterling scoffed, his bravado returning. "Does this procedural delay have anything to do with you?" Elias finally turned his head, his answer chillingly simple. "Yes." Sterling stared, his face a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. "What are you? Some kind of government agent?" Elias raised an eyebrow slightly. "Something like that." Meanwhile, at a local news station, a young digital producer named Kevin hit publish on a breaking news alert. Summit Air flight grounded, amid allegations of a racist incident on board. He had no idea who the passenger was. He would soon find out. In the primary boardroom of Summit Air's Atlanta headquarters, the atmosphere had devolved from concern to outright panic. Screens flickered with real-time flight data. Delayed flights were cascading across the network as grounded planes created a domino effect. A large red triangle pulsed next to flight number 812. But now, others were joining it. 819, 822, 841. Each had the same status. Locked by federal protocol. David Chen stood at the head of the conference table, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. He stared at the screen as if his gaze alone could reverse the damage. His executive team spoke in hushed, urgent tones into their phones, trying to manage the fallout. "Shut it down," he said, his voice raw. "Kill the override signal." "We can't," replied Monica Shaw, the VP of Regulatory Compliance. Her voice was sharp and brittle. "The command didn't originate from our network. The FAA has confirmed they didn't issue it either. This came through the private Nexus Oversight firewall. We have no authority there." "Are you telling me we were hacked?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you they have a key to our house, and we never knew it was on their keychain." Chen's jaw tightened. "Find out what other keys they have. Today." 2 floors down, in the corporate communications hub, Jason Miller, the head of PR, was juggling 4 different monitors: TikTok, X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, and now the major news outlets. The video of Greg and Elias was everywhere. Captions ranged from racial profiling at 30,000 feet to billionaire CEO ejected from first class. One viral clip had isolated the moment Elias spoke those 3 words: initiate system-wide lockdown, slowing down the audio and intercutting it with images of the growing list of delayed Summit Air flights. It was captioned, "He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He just unplugged their entire airline." Jason buried his face in his hands. "This is a 5-alarm fire." An assistant rushed in, holding a tablet with a screenshot. "It's him. The passenger is Elias Vance, founder and CEO of Nexus Oversight, former White House cybersecurity advisor. He leads the Federal Infrastructure and Ethics Partnership Initiative. He helped write the Tier 0 protocols." Jason stared, his blood turning to ice. "That's not just a Tier 0 flag. That's a corporate death warrant." Back on the aircraft, Greg was still hovering anxiously in the forward galley. He hadn't touched the intercom since the messages appeared. The color had completely drained from his face. His direct supervisor had boarded the plane, whispered something in his ear, and then escorted him off without a word. He had not returned. Elias was still in seat 3A. He hadn't said a word. The cabin, once filled with the arrogant chatter of the privileged, was now eerily silent. A man in seat 4A had put away his tablet and was now just watching him. A young woman a few rows back kept looking from her phone to Elias's face, trying to reconcile the viral video with the composed man sitting across from her. Sterling, for the first time in what was likely a very long time, was speechless. He just kept sipping his champagne, his eyes darting toward the front every time a uniformed crew member moved. The aircraft was in a state of suspended animation. No one boarded. No one deplaned. The air conditioning had cycled down to a low hum, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a secure call woke the FAA administrator at his home. It was barely 7 a.m. "Nexus Oversight has activated Tier 0 protocols on Summit Air Flight 812, the voice stated. "Passenger is Elias Vance." The administrator sat bolt upright in bed. "God damn it, what did Summit Air do?" "Pulled him out of his paid first-class seat. The video is already everywhere." "Shut them down." "They're already shut down." He did it himself. The administrator exhaled slowly. "Get the Oversight Committee on a call. This is about to get very, very political." On the West Coast, Elias's name had just hit the major tech and news aggregators. TechCrunch, The Guardian, Forbes, and a dozen other outlets had picked up the story. The narrative wasn't just taking shape, it was exploding. And yet, inside the aircraft, Elias simply closed his eyes. Composed. Deliberate. He had said everything he needed to say. Back at Summit Air HQ, the General Counsel was now in the room, his voice clipped and rapid. "We need to release an official statement. Start with an internal memo. Acknowledge a procedural error and state that we are conducting a thorough investigation. Project that we have this under control." Chen slammed his hand on the table. "We are not in control. We are being vivisected in public in real time." The lawyer didn't even blink. "Then we must act like we are not the ones at fault. Who authorized Greg to confront a Tier 0 passenger?" "He didn't know. That's the entire point." "Why didn't he know?" Silence filled the room. The screens continued their relentless flicker. Flight 812 was still bathed in red, so were 21 others. By the time the clock struck 10 a.m. Eastern, Summit Air was no longer just a trending topic. It was a dumpster fire. The video of Elias being forcibly removed from seat 3A had surpassed 2 million views and had been remixed and re-edited into dozens of viral memes. TikTok creators used dramatic music to underscore his calm defiance. An X thread titled, "Everything Wrong with Summit Air in Under 2 Minutes," compiled customer complaints dating back a decade. Instagram posts paired Elias's unwavering gaze with quotes from James Baldwin and Martin Luther King Jr. Someone found Greg's Facebook profile. Another user dug up a politically charged meme he had shared years earlier and reposted it with the caption, "Is this your employee at Summit Air?" Through it all, Elias Vance said nothing. He hadn't made a statement, hadn't tweeted, hadn't moved. His silence became the narrative's central mystery, amplifying its power. An entire corporate brand was unraveling, and he hadn't spoken a single word since initiate system-wide lockdown. In the control room of a major 24-hour news network, anchor Brenda Walsh shuffled her scripts as a producer rushed onto the set, waving a tablet. "Scrap the next segment. Run this. It's verified." Brenda glanced at the screen and saw the frozen image of Greg's hand clamped on Elias's arm. Her eyes widened. "Are we confirming FAA lockdown?" "Confirmed. Tier 0 activation. The passenger is Elias Vance. He's the founder of Nexus Oversight. He triggered the lockdown himself." Brenda stared, processing the information. And Summit Air had no idea who he was? They know now. Across the studio, the graphics team was already at work. One screen displayed the Summit Air logo, which appeared to be bleeding as flight cancellation notices popped up around it. Another screen showed a map of North America with dozens of glowing red dots, each representing a grounded Summit Air flight. It looked less like an airline and more like a plague. Meanwhile, in a shared office space in Austin, Texas, a team of digital activists launched a coordinated hashtag campaign. #Respect3A, #Grounded for Good, #Summit Collapse. Within minutes, graphic designers had turned Elias's calm posture into a stylized stencil. T-shirts appeared for sale online. Social media influencers posted photos of themselves with captions like, "Channeling my inner Elias Vance today." On Reddit, a user claiming to be a former Summit Air employee started an Ask Me Anything thread about what he termed the airline's culture of color coding. He detailed years of alleged discriminatory practices, biased performance reviews for non-white employees, unexplained denials of travel benefits, and a system where customer complaints against certain staff members were systematically buried. The post rocketed to the front page of the site. Inside Summit Air's emergency command center, the atmosphere had grown thick with sweat and fear. Executives paced back and forth, rolling up their sleeves as if preparing for a physical fight. But no one was taking effective action. A large digital display showed 4 different news networks simultaneously lambasting the airline for its disastrous failure. Legal advisors repeatedly suggested issuing a public apology. The PR team wrote and rewrote drafts, only for them to be vetoed by lawyers who found them either too self-incriminating or not apologetic enough. David Chen leaned against the edge of the conference table, his palms pressed flat, the veins in his forearms bulging. "I need one person, one voice, who can get in front of this without pouring more gasoline on the fire." Jason Miller, the PR head, spoke from the corner of the room. "There's only one person who can do that now. Elias Vance. He won't even take our calls." "He doesn't need to," Jason said, his voice grim. "He's already made his statement." A new headline flashed on one of the screens. Nexus Oversight issues internal lockdown, notice to Summit Air. The article below quoted unnamed sources within Nexus Oversight, who confirmed that Vance's activation of the protocol had triggered a full-spectrum ethics and compliance review. This was no longer just a PR crisis. It was a hostile takeover disguised as an audit. Inside the aircraft, the mood had undergone a strange transformation. The initial anger and frustration of the passengers had morphed into a quiet curiosity. No one dared to approach Elias, but the energy in the first-class cabin was now tinged with a strange kind of awe, as if they were seated next to a man who had accomplished the impossible. A woman whispered to her husband that they should try to get off the flight before things escalated further. Her husband whispered back, "I wouldn't miss this for the world. I think we're watching a piece of history being made." Greg was gone. At some point, he had been quietly and unceremoniously escorted off the plane. No one had made a sound. 1 minute, he was standing near the galley, pale and perspiring. The next, he was simply gone. No one seemed to miss him. Back in Washington, the FAA Oversight Committee had already met via a secure video conference. The chairman posed a single question. Does the subject possess the legal authority for this override? Yes, came the immediate response. Nexus Oversight's clearance was granted under the Federal Infrastructure Security Act of 2023. Vance's position as its head gives him network lockdown privileges for the purpose of public safety and ethics audits. Was there a genuine risk to public safety? There was a pregnant pause. Then the first voice replied, "This will be classified as a moral safety audit, and this agency will not intervene." The chairman nodded. "Let the system correct itself." From that moment on, the FAA officially took a step back. Nexus Oversight was now in complete control. At the same time, a new video began to trend online, this one edited by a user with a flair for the dramatic. It opened with a shot of Elias's silent, unflinching gaze, then cut to a time-stamped FAA flight freeze notification, and finally zoomed out to a global flight map turning blood red. The video ended with a simple line of text. He didn't have to raise his voice. He just had to be present. Views: 7.2 million and climbing. Elias Vance had never been a man who courted the spotlight. His entire career had been built in the quiet, unseen corridors of power. His time at the National Security Agency had left almost no digital trail. His name appeared only sporadically in academic papers on digital infrastructure and ethical AI, but he never gave interviews, never appeared on panels. His creation of Nexus Oversight had followed a similar trajectory: influence without spectacle, authority without arrogance. This made the current maelstrom all the more surreal. At Nexus Oversight's headquarters in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was not one of panic, but of quiet, focused intensity. The silence was not born of fear, but of purpose. Every analyst was at their station, every screen glowing with data streams. In contrast to Summit Air's chaotic implosion, Nexus Oversight moved with the precision of a surgical team. In the primary operations center on the 27th floor, a team of forensic data analysts was already deep within Summit Air's internal servers, scanning for patterns of non-compliance, suppressed incident reports, and algorithmic bias in their HR systems. They weren't interested in PR spin. They were looking for the root of the rot. At the heart of the operation stood Isabel Rios, Nexus's chief operating officer. With her arms crossed, she watched the main screen as the video of the incident was analyzed frame by frame by their proprietary AI. The software tagged micro-expressions, vocal tones, and crowd dynamics, cross-referencing them with a massive database of ethical compliance case studies. Greg's behavior was already classified by the system as targeted de-escalation failure, risk class 5. One of the lead analysts, a former federal prosecutor, looked up from his monitor. Summit Air is about to learn that this isn't a public relations problem. It's a structural one. Isabel allowed herself a thin, cold smile. They're just starting to realize that now. Across town, a legislative aide handed a tablet to Congresswoman Eleanor Davies. She was one of a handful of legislators who had championed the Federal Infrastructure Security Act the previous year, the very bill that granted organizations like Nexus Oversight the power to enforce compliance in civilian sectors. The aide pointed to the name on the screen. Elias Vance? He's the one they pulled from his seat? The Congresswoman nodded slowly. Yes, he is. She opened the file. The photograph of Elias was a formal ID badge photo from his security clearance. It showed a man with calm, intelligent eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, his gaze direct and unflinching. She tapped the screen. Summit Air just tried to bully the one man you can't bully. Back on the plane, the crew had made no moves to restart boarding. Every so often, a new staff member from the terminal would board, whisper to the remaining flight attendants, and then quickly disembark. The attendants would then cast furtive glances around the cabin, but they made no announcements. Elias, for his part, sat like a statue. His posture had not changed. His phone had not reappeared. His silence was now a palpable force, unsettling everyone in his vicinity. Further back in the plane, in the economy section, a passenger sent a message to a private chat group. It read, "The guy in 3A just single-handedly started a federal investigation, and I had a front row seat." That passenger was Ben Carter, a software developer who was flying back from a tech conference. He didn't know Elias personally, but he had attended a seminar led by him 2 years prior in Silicon Valley. Vance had spoken for only 20 minutes, then spent the next hour listening to questions. When someone had asked what real power Nexus Oversight held, Elias had simply replied, "Enough to turn things off until they are rebuilt correctly." Ben now stared at Elias's silhouette, his face a mask of awe. He whispered to himself, "He wasn't bluffing?" Meanwhile, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Dallas, the CEO of a rival airline, Atlantic Air, rewatched the viral video for the 5th time. His executive team sat around him, their expressions a mixture of shock and grim fascination. Several were taking notes. One had already instructed their chief diversity officer to immediately begin an audit of their own internal records. "Should we release a statement?" someone asked. The CEO didn't take his eyes off the screen. "No, not yet. This isn't about making statements. This is about watching an empire burn and learning from their mistakes." Someone else murmured, "This Vance fellow, he's not just playing defense. He's rewriting the entire game." Back in Atlanta, Summit Air was hemorrhaging from every conceivable angle. The calls were relentless. Shareholders demanded explanations. Corporate partners were trying to distance themselves. Employees were demanding guidance. And David Chen just wanted the nightmare to end. He paced his office, rereading the 5th draft of an apology letter that his legal team still wouldn't approve. Every word was a potential landmine. Admit too much, and they would be buried in lawsuits. Admit too little, and they would be devoured by the court of public opinion. He looked at the latest version. "We sincerely apologize for the experience of Mr. Elias Vance and are using this as a valuable opportunity for reflection and growth." It sounded like a note written by a high school principal. Pathetic. Chen deleted the entire document and slammed his laptop shut. In another office, Monica Shaw was on a call with a federal liaison from the Department of Transportation. "Yes," she said, her voice strained. "We are fully aware of the gravity of the situation. No, he was not properly identified by our staff. Yes, we take full responsibility for the actions of our employee. No, we do not currently have a training protocol for identifying Tier 0 passengers. Yes, we are developing one as we speak. She paused. Frankly, we didn't think they were real. On the other end of the line, the liaison replied coldly, "Not only are they real, they are now the new precedent." Monica hung up the phone without another word. Across the hall, Jason Miller had stepped out into the emergency stairwell for a breath of fresh air. He leaned against the cool concrete, his phone vibrating in his hand with dozens of unread notifications. He knew this was no longer about PR. It was no longer about brand management or crisis communications. It was about a simple, undeniable fact. They had treated a black man in first class like an intruder, and he had the power to make them burn for it without ever raising his voice. In the air traffic control tower at Los Angeles International Airport, Supervisor Maria Rodriguez stared at the chaotic flight matrix on her screen. An aide quietly approached and handed her a printed bulletin with a thick red border. Her eyes narrowed as she read. "Nexus Oversight has initiated a full compliance lockdown," the aide whispered. "Flight 812 isn't just a single grounded plane. It's the first domino in a cascading federal audit." Maria swore under her breath. "How many of our outbound summit flights are affected?" 27 and counting. May God have mercy on them. On the East Coast, in a quiet home office in a leafy suburb of Boston, a journalist named Sarah Jenkins was on her third pot of coffee and had just declined her 10th interview request of the morning. She didn't work for a major news network. She ran a highly respected Substack newsletter, followed by a niche but influential audience of policymakers, tech executives, and venture capitalists. She had written about Nexus Oversight's growing influence months before most people knew the company existed. Now, her inbox was a digital wildfire. She opened a new draft. The title came to her instantly: "The Man Who Weaponized Silence." She began to type. Elias Vance did not shout. He did not resist. He did not release a statement. But with 3 quiet words, he reminded an entire industry, and perhaps the entire country, that true power is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives so quietly, you don't even hear it until it's already taken your world apart. While Sarah wrote, other news organizations scrambled to keep up. Summit Air's beleaguered PR department sent out a hastily composed press release to the national media, which was almost universally ignored or ridiculed online. One news anchor read a portion of the statement on air, then looked directly into the camera and said, "If that is the full extent of your apology, you have already lost." Simultaneously, Nexus Oversight quietly began dispatching a series of federal compliance requests to various departments within Summit Air. They weren't phrased as accusations. They were simple, direct demands for access to data logs, internal chat histories, conflict resolution training materials, and hiring and promotion records. Each request was time-stamped, logged, and copied to a secure federal database. On the compliance floor at Summit Air's headquarters, a junior analyst named Emily opened the first of these requests, and her hands began to shake. "They want everything," she whispered. "Everything from the last 5 years." Her supervisor's face went pale. "They're not auditing an incident. They're auditing a culture." Meanwhile, Elias Vance remained silent. Inside the grounded aircraft, he hadn't moved. The cabin lights had been dimmed to conserve power. The other passengers had fallen into a quiet, watchful hush, their gazes fixed on him with a kind of solemn awe, as if they were observing a force of nature. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, someone did. A young flight attendant, not Greg, but a woman with weary, apologetic eyes, approached his seat. She knelt slightly to be at his eye level. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, I am so sorry for what happened to you today." Elias nodded once. It was not a dismissal, but an acknowledgement. From the back of the cabin, a child's voice asked, "Mommy, is that man why we can't go home?" A mother replied quietly, "No, sweetheart. He's the reason things are finally getting fixed." Elsewhere, a hedge fund manager named Robert Thorne stared in horror at his terminal as Summit Air's stock plummeted past its quarterly support level. His firm had a massive position in the airline. Now he was watching that investment evaporate in real time. "Sell," he barked at his trader. "Dump all of it, now." "But we'll take a catastrophic loss," the trader protested. "We'll take an even bigger one if we hold on. The man in 3A just sank the entire company." The trader hesitated. What if he's planning to buy it? Robert froze. What? What if Vance isn't just trying to punish them? What if this is a prelude to an acquisition? The thought was more chilling than Robert wanted to admit, because deep down, he knew it wasn't just possible. It was probably already in motion. Back in D.C., Isabel Rios had just received authorization to initiate Phase 2 of Nexus Oversight's compliance audit. This meant deploying on-site inspection teams, conducting third-party evaluations, and carrying out direct interviews with Summit Air employees. She gave the order without a moment's hesitation. For every minute Summit Air was grounded, Nexus Oversight's power grew. On the surface, Elias was just a man sitting quietly in his seat. But beneath the surface, the entire system was being rewired around him. The collapse was not a loud explosion. It didn't rip through the headlines in a single catastrophic event. It was quieter than that, slower, but far more profound. By noon Central Time, the phrase Nexus Protocol had become part of the national conversation. News pundits debated its implications. Policy analysts speculated on its reach. Politicians from key transportation committees released vague, non-committal statements promising to review the situation. But at Summit Air, there was no time for review, only for damage control. The audit began not with interviews, but with credentials. Dozens of user accounts belonging to regional managers, senior HR officers, and crew supervisors were flagged for immediate review. Nexus Oversight's proprietary software combed through years of internal emails and chat logs, flagging keyword clusters, highlighting anomalies, and identifying patterns. Inappropriate jokes made in private channels, incident reports that were closed without investigation, and diversity and inclusion recommendations that were repeatedly ignored. On the 19th floor of Summit Air's headquarters, a newly formed emergency HR committee tried to conduct internal interviews. But no one was talking to them. Instead, employees were whispering to each other in hallways, messaging on encrypted apps, and trying to figure out who was to blame and how to avoid the fallout. A senior vice president, a woman named Catherine Lee, stood before a room of ashen-faced regional directors. A PowerPoint presentation with charts showing steep, downward red lines glowed behind her. "This is not just a branding issue," she stated, her voice tight with controlled panic. "This is a systemic failure. If Nexus Oversight's audit reveals even one provable instance of racial bias that was either normalized or ignored, our liability is almost limitless. We could face actions under employment law, passenger rights legislation, federal compliance statutes, and even Title VI of the Civil Rights Act." Someone in the back raised a shaky hand. "Are they accusing us?" Catherine looked directly at him. "Not yet. But after what happened yesterday, no one is giving us the benefit of the doubt." Down in the IT security department, a small team was painstakingly going through Greg's digital footprint. His official employee file showed no major red flags. He had consistently passed his basic conduct reviews. But when they gained access to his archived direct messages, a more troubling picture emerged. A pattern of microaggressions, condescending comments about certain passengers, and jokes that, when read out of context, were not jokes at all. A report automatically generated by the system displayed its findings. Cumulative pattern of coded bias. Flag level 4. Nexus Oversight had a term for this. A systemic fault line. By the end of the day, over 40 Summit Air employees had been suspended, cut off from company communications, or placed under formal internal review. Not a single one of them had spoken to Elias Vance. He had not made a single call. Yet his influence was now dictating the movements of every single department. In the finance department, an analyst named Aisha Sharma quietly began cross-referencing employee demographic data with promotion records. No one had asked her to, but she had long suspected that the path to senior management seemed to be closed to people who looked like her. Now, for the first time, she had access to the data to prove it. And for the first time, there was someone in charge who might actually listen. Out in the terminals, the chaos continued. Summit Air's delays had morphed into widespread cancellations. At some airports, passengers were being rebooked on other airlines. At others, they were simply given refunds and travel vouchers. But no one wanted Summit Air vouchers anymore. A businessman walking past the customer service desk at Chicago O'Hare said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is what happens when you mess with the wrong person." No one disagreed. Several people nodded in assent. Inside the aircraft, Elias remained still. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across his seat. But he had not moved. He would occasionally glance out the window, his expression distant and unreadable. A woman seated a few rows behind him whispered to her companion, "He hasn't even raised his voice. I think that's what terrifies them the most." Back at Nexus Oversight's command center, Isabel Rios received a brief, encrypted message. Confirmed pattern breach in 7 regional hubs. Code Black sustained. Recommending escalation to Phase 3. She approved it without hesitation. Phase 3 meant the audit's findings would be made public, with direct oversight from FAA observers. It meant full media access. It meant complete exposure. In a television studio in New York, a panel of experts was heatedly debating the future of corporate responsibility. A retired airline CEO argued, "You can't allow an outside entity to dictate your internal company culture." Another panelist, a civil rights attorney, shot back, "Then maybe your internal company culture shouldn't involve dragging a paying customer out of his first-class seat because he's black." The silence that followed was more profound than anything Elias had said, because Elias hadn't had to say anything. And yet everything had already changed. The boardroom was freezing, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the silence. It was a dense, suffocating silence that settles over a catastrophe. At the head of the long, polished table, CEO David Chen stared at a large screen displaying all the active Nexus oversight requests across Summit Air's various departments. There were 32 distinct federal-level information demands, 15 compliance interviews, and 7 personnel flagged for direct cause termination. And none of it had come from a regulator or a court. It had all been triggered by the man in seat 3A. "We are not going to make it through this. whispered board member Robert Miller, finally breaking the silence. Not if we let them continue to bleed us dry like this. Let them? Chen scoffed. We gave them the keys to the castle. This is not a negotiation. It's damage control. Another board member, Patricia Wexler, leaned forward. What if we offer to bring Vance in? Make him an advisor? A chair of a new ethics committee? Are you out of your mind? Another voice retorted. He's the reason our company's value has been halved in a single day. You want to give him a seat at the table? He already has a seat at the table, Robert said flatly. The lead legal counsel, Frank Monroe, cleared his throat. Technically, his company possesses voting power over our internal compliance policies due to a minority stake acquired through a federal infrastructure oversight grant. If he chooses to escalate this to a Class C audit, he can demand executive dismissals. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Patricia sank back in her chair. Someone at the end of the table muttered a curse under their breath. Jason Miller, still looking exhausted from 2 sleepless nights of trying to craft a believable PR narrative, spoke quietly. He doesn't want a seat at our table. He wants to flip the whole table over. Then came the words everyone had been dreading. Monica Shaw, the VP of Compliance, stood up slowly. We need to offer a sacrifice. All heads turned to her. We've lost control of the story, she continued. We are long past the point where we can frame this as a simple mistake. Our only remaining option is to isolate the problem, give it a name, and publicly sever it. Greg, Chen said instantly. Everyone nodded. That's not enough, Monica replied. We need someone with more authority, a manager who approved his performance reviews, a regional director who failed to act on previous complaints. Someone the media can tear into, Jason interjected, or we do the unthinkable. We step down, admit the failure is systemic, and allow Vance's team to help us rebuild. That's corporate suicide, a director muttered. We'd be inviting a fox into our henhouse. Jason's voice grew firm. The fox is already in the henhouse. You just haven't realized it's been going through your financial records for the past 6 hours. Meanwhile, in a smaller office down the hall, 2 ambitious vice presidents were already plotting their own survival. One was discreetly emailing a contact at a rival airline, offering off-the-record insights. The other was carefully crafting their resignation letter, filled with enough manufactured outrage to appear righteous without admitting any culpability. In every part of the company, people were trying to get clear of the blast zone. At that moment, a new article appeared on a major business news wire. Inside the Summit Air collapse, board seeks scapegoats as federal pressure intensifies. The leak was swift, precise, and laced with just enough damning truth to reveal their desperation. Isabel Rios read the article in real time from her office at Nexus Oversight and knew exactly what it signaled. The board was no longer attempting to solve the problem. They were just trying to survive it. No one knew what to anticipate. For nearly 36 hours, Elias Vance had remained silent. Not to the media, not to the airline, and not to the passengers who were still watching him from behind the tinted windows of the terminal. And now, a single podium stood before a stark, gray backdrop in a packed briefing room at the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, adorned with only the Nexus Oversight logo and a simple phrase, "Accountability is non-negotiable." Rows of journalists murmured amongst themselves as camera crews made final adjustments. At precisely 10 a.m., a side door opened, and Elias Vance walked out. He wore no entourage, offered no preamble, just a simple dark navy suit, a crisp white shirt with no tie, and a face that was neither angry nor triumphant, but clear, calm and final. The room went silent. He did not start with platitudes or thanks. He looked directly into the cameras and began. Yesterday morning, I was forcibly removed from a seat I had paid for because a company that had prioritized profit over people had forgotten that respect is not a premium tier amenity. A wave of whispers passed through the room. He continued, his voice even and measured. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten to sue. I did not ask for an apology. I spoke 3 words. He paused, letting the silence hang as cameras clicked. That phrase activated a pre-authorized federal compliance protocol linked to my firm's oversight authority under the 2023 Infrastructure Security Act. That authority includes the power to suspend corporate operations, mandate internal audits, and freeze company assets pending a full ethics review. He glanced down at his notes for a brief moment, then looked back up. Summit Air failed that review before it had even formally begun, not because of the actions of a single flight attendant, but because of a corporate culture that allowed such an action to be conceivable. He let that sink in. But we were watching. He took a slight step back from the podium, his voice unwavering. I am not here today to punish. I am here to recalibrate. And what our preliminary audit has revealed is a system so eroded by institutional bias that it confused arrogance with authority. Hands shot up across the press corps, but Elias was not finished. Over the last 24 hours, Nexus Oversight has invoked its full audit authority. As of this morning, we have suspended all executive bonus payouts, frozen their corporate expense accounts, and are in the process of compiling a full transparency report to be submitted under federal ethics regulations. A journalist shouted out, "Are you attempting a hostile takeover of the company?" Elias turned to face her. "No, we have already taken it over." A stunned silence washed over the room. He let it linger for a beat. Our acquisition of a controlling compliance stake was finalized 2 days ago. As of this moment, Nexus Oversight has assumed control over Summit Air. We are not shutting them down. We are rebuilding them from their foundation up. The room erupted into a cacophony of shouts and flashing cameras. Elias raised a hand, and the noise subsided. One final point. To the people who witnessed what transpired, who used their phones to record it, who said nothing, but whose presence bore witness, thank you. Your silence was also a form of power. And with that, he stepped away from the podium. There was no Q&A, no further explanation, just control. The footage was on every screen before Elias had even left the room. Within minutes, every news network had cut to a live shot of the podium. Cable news anchors scrambled to keep up, their headlines hastily written as the reality of the situation sank in. Summit Air had not been defeated by a lawsuit or a scandal. It had been surgically dismantled and reassembled from within by the very man it had sought to humiliate. Elias Vance did not look back as he walked out of the press room. As he passed a gauntlet of blinking cameras and dumbfounded reporters, someone whispered, "He just took an entire airline without even raising his voice." Outside, a black SUV was waiting at the curb. The door swung open the moment he approached. Inside, Isabel Rios sat with a tablet already displaying Nexus Oversight's internal dashboard, which scrolled with quiet, authoritative data. Elias slid into the seat without a word. Isabel handed him a bottle of water. "They're calling it the Vance Mandate." Elias allowed himself a brief, fleeting smile. "It's catchy, but dangerous." Back at Summit Air headquarters, the atmosphere was far less composed. The press conference had been streamed live on every monitor in the building. When Elias said, "We are rebuilding them from their foundation up," 3 members of the legal team stood up and walked directly to the HR department to tender their resignations. They did not return. Monica Shaw sat frozen in her chair. Jason Miller stared blankly at the floor. CEO David Chen said nothing. For the first time, he had no response, no countermove. He and everyone else in the room knew that the board no longer ran the company. Elias Vance did. That realization sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. Rival airlines convened emergency board meetings. Compliance officers worked through the night, frantically redrafting their ethics and training protocols. The CEO of one airline reportedly yelled into a speakerphone, "If any of our staff so much as looks at a black passenger the wrong way, you are to call me directly." Is that understood? On social media, the narrative evolved by the second. The trending hashtag changed from #GroundedForGood to #TheVanceStandard. Think pieces and opinion columns appeared within hours. A viral clip of Elias's line, "I am not here today to punish, I am here to recalibrate," was already being set to dramatic orchestral music overlaid with footage of grounded airplanes. Meanwhile, Greg sat alone in a sterile hotel room. The company had locked him out of his accounts. His phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, some sympathetic, but most filled with venom. He watched the press conference 4 times. Each time, the words cut deeper. He was not mentioned by name, but he was the ghost haunting every sentence. The $100 bill he had pocketed, the wrist he had twisted, the quiet confidence he had mocked. It had all led to this. He tried to call Arthur Sterling. The call went straight to voicemail. Sterling, the man who had encouraged him, who had smirked in satisfaction as Elias was removed from his seat, had disappeared from the public eye. His company had released a generic statement about individual accountability, but offered no specific apology. At the same time, a young woman named Maya, the one who had filmed the original video, sat in a coffee shop, watching it replay with captions. She had never spoken to Elias, had never intended for the video to go viral. Now her inbox was flooded with media requests, and all she could think was, he didn't need any help. He just knew what to do. Back in the SUV, Isabel reviewed the immediate aftermath on her tablet. 7 executives have resigned in the past 10 minutes. Summit's compliance portal has locked out 45 senior-level employees. Elias nodded. It's time. Begin Phase 4. Isabel didn't have to ask what that meant. She simply tapped her screen. Elsewhere, in a polished conference room at the Department of Transportation, 2 federal auditors watched the press conference again in stunned silence. "Do you think he's planning a full acquisition?" one asked. The other shook his head. "That was never his objective." "Then what was?" The reply was simple. Proof. Because Elias hadn't said he was seeking justice. He had proven he could create it from scratch. In the 48 hours that followed the press conference, the world didn't just listen, it recalibrated. The stock market shuddered. Airline stocks across the board took a double-digit hit, with Summit Air plummeting another 60% before the SEC halted trading. PR firms were in a frenzy, retrofitting their clients' diversity statements, while corporate boards convened in emergency sessions to ask one terrifying question. If this could happen to Summit Air, are we next? In a high-rise office in Dallas, the CEO of Atlantic Air had the transcript of Elias Vance's speech read aloud to his executive team. He then pointed a trembling finger at his head of HR. "Tell me right now, how many discrimination complaints we have swept under the rug in the last year. I want names, I want dates, and I want flight numbers. Today." Journalists began to publish deep dives into the industry, unearthing buried memos, former employee testimonies, and confidential lawsuit settlements that had been quietly resolved over the years. It quickly became clear that Summit Air's problems were not unique. They weren't even uncommon. What made them different was that Elias Vance had chosen to make them a case study. And now, every other airline was being graded on the same curve. At Nexus Oversight headquarters, Isabel Rios stood before a war board covered with data points, strategic timelines, and digital logs. On one side, a list was titled Next Steps, Phase 4. It included 7 major airlines, 14 regional carriers, and 4 charter services. Each had a documented history of compliance issues. Each had been given warnings. None had fundamentally changed. At the center of the board was a single, high-resolution photo of Seat 3A. She looked up as Elias walked in. "The media is going after Sterling," she said. "Apparently, his investment firm has discriminatory hiring practices baked into its vendor contracts." Elias nodded. "Good. Let the rot be exposed." He tried to issue a statement to the New York Times. They refused to publish it. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Why?" They said his silence was finally speaking for itself. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the edge of Elias's lips. He turned to the main monitor, where a data visualization showed a heat map of FAA compliance issues. Red dots pulsed across the country like a viral outbreak. Nexus oversight teams were already on the ground in 6 cities. "We are doing more than just auditing," Elias said, his voice quiet. "We are establishing a new precedent." Back at Summit Air's now gutted headquarters, the internal fallout was far from over. Employee forums were being flooded with leaked internal documents. Mid-level managers were caught in a panicked debate. Resign now or try to weather the storm? An anonymous email sent to the entire company simply read, "They paid us to serve passengers, not to sort them." Jason Miller had not slept in 2 days, but he stood by his office window, watching the clouds drift by like passing accusations. He had been on the board that approved the employee conduct reviews. He had seen the complaint logs, had skimmed over them without giving them a second thought. He now understood with sickening clarity that silence was not a neutral position. It was a form of complicity. His phone buzzed. It was an email from HR. The subject line was Mandatory Ethics and Compliance Debriefing, 1:30 p.m. He sat down and waited. Meanwhile, at a law school in Chicago, a professor was using Elias's press conference as a case study in corporate law and ethics. "This," she explained to her students, "is what occurs when immense power intersects with meticulous preparation, when visibility is weaponized with surgical restraint, when silence is not a sign of weakness, but a carefully engineered strategy." In a small apartment in Houston, a teenager watched the press conference again on her laptop. She was wearing a sweatshirt that said in bold letters, "Know your worth." Her mother walked by and asked what she was watching. She replied simply, "History." And in a quiet house in a gated community, Greg stared at a blank television screen. The blinds were drawn. His phone was turned off. He had become a symbol, but not in the way he had ever imagined. The news reports now referred to him only as the flight attendant. He wondered if there was a word for a kind of regret that arrives long after it can be of any use. Back at Nexus Oversight, Isabel turned from her screen. "Elias, one more thing. The Department of Transportation is requesting a meeting. Top level. Closed session." Elias nodded slowly. "Set it up." Outside, the wind began to pick up. But inside Nexus Oversight, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. 3 days after the press conference, Elias Vance entered a secure meeting room deep within the Department of Transportation building in Washington, D.C. The room was stark and windowless, illuminated by cold flat ceiling panels. Seated around a large oval table were 12 individuals, senior White House advisors, federal auditors, and transportation policy experts. A few were shuffling papers. Most simply watched him as he entered. Elias did not offer greetings or handshakes. He just gave a slight nod and took a seat. There was no nameplate in front of him, no aide by his side. A woman at the head of the table leaned forward. "Mr. Vance, we appreciate you agreeing to meet with us." "I didn't agree," Elias stated calmly. "I accepted your summons." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Someone coughed. The woman forced a thin smile. "Fair enough?" A man to her left spoke up. "Your actions have generated unprecedented public and political pressure. The president has been briefed. We need to understand your long-term intentions." Elias opened a slim folder and placed a single sheet of paper in front of them. It contained only 3 bullet points. 1. Mandatory, third-party verified bias and de-escalation training for all FAA-certified airline personnel. 2. The creation of a federally funded, independent passenger equity and dignity task force. 3. A proposed amendment to all federal aviation funding contracts, adding a mandatory ethical conduct and compliance clause. He said, "These are not proposals. These are the new terms." Murmurs rippled around the table. One man scoffed. "You are talking about overhauling an entire regulatory framework based on a single incident." Elias's gaze was like cold steel. "It is not based on a single incident. It is based on tens of thousands of incidents that were ignored. I am simply the first person to arrive at this table with enough leverage to make you listen." The room went silent again. He continued, "You have 2 choices. You can work with us to draft these changes, or you can wait until the public pressure forces your hand. Either way, this will happen. We will outlast the current system." Silence. Then, the woman at the head of the table nodded slowly. "We will take these proposals under advisement." Elias stood up. "There is no need. I have already scheduled the first stakeholder meeting. You should find the invitation in your inboxes." He left without looking back. That evening, the headlines shifted once again. Vance delivers ultimatum to DOT. Reform or be replaced. Inside Summit Air's now half-deserted executive wing, Greg's nameplate had been taken down. His former colleagues would hurry past his empty office, avoiding eye contact, as if it were a memorial to a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Arthur Sterling was photographed by paparazzi as he left his Park Avenue apartment, trying to shield his face from the cameras. A reporter's microphone caught him muttering, "It was just a goddamn seat," before he was swarmed by a barrage of flashes. On television, a retired airline captain gave an emotional interview. "I saw things. I saw passengers being disrespected, being mistreated. I always told myself it wasn't my place to interfere." Vance proved that it is all of our jobs to interfere. The hashtags had evolved once more. #Fly with Dignity, #The Vance Clause, #Seat 3A. Back in Elias's private office at Nexus Oversight, Isabel walked in holding a thick binder. "The requests are pouring in. Speaking engagements at Harvard and Stanford, university endowments, and 3 separate offers to run for public office." Elias didn't even look up from his screen. "Decline them all." "All of them?" "Yes. My goal is not to be well known. It is to be effective." She paused. "We've also received a letter from a flight attendant at Atlantic Air. She says she witnessed a supervisor mock a passenger with a disability last year. She was too afraid to speak up then, but now she wants to give a sworn statement. Elias finally looked up. That's the entire point. He stood and walked over to the wall where a single framed photograph of an empty airplane seat now hung. Seat 3A. Change doesn't begin with an exercise of power, he said quietly. It begins with one person deciding that silence is no longer an option. Outside, the world was still watching, but Elias Vance was already focused on his next objective. The reckoning did not arrive with a thunderclap. It unfolded in a deafening silence. Within a week, a dozen major airlines had issued joint public statements, some filled with remorse, others cautiously preemptive. Words like dignity, integrity, and inclusion appeared in shareholder reports and on corporate websites. One CEO resigned before his board could even schedule a vote. Another held a tearful, live-streamed town hall with his employees. It was all a desperate attempt to catch up to a standard that had already been set. Nexus Oversight had become more than just a company. It was now a new benchmark for corporate responsibility. At a press event in Chicago, reporters swarmed the new interim CEO of Summit Air. She read haltingly from a prepared statement. We acknowledge the recent events that have rightly eroded public trust in our airline. We are committed to a future of full transparency, third-party oversight, and equity-focused reform. There was no applause. In private, unmarked conference rooms across Washington, transportation lobbyists and airline executives met in panicked, hushed tones. Some were furious, some were terrified. All of them were trying to anticipate Elias Vance's next move. They had no idea that Elias had already moved on to building something far more ambitious. While the airlines scrambled to react, Elias traveled. Quietly, with no media, no entourage. Just him and Isabel, moving from city to city, meeting with people who had been silenced for years. A Sikh man who was removed from a flight because other passengers felt uncomfortable. A mother with an autistic child who was forced to deplane because the child was making noises. A disabled veteran who was denied boarding because his wheelchair took too long to load. Elias didn't record these meetings. He just listened. He took notes. And then he did something no one saw coming. He offered them jobs. Not just advisory roles, but positions on the board of a new division within Nexus Oversight. Isabel watched, both impressed and slightly unnerved. You're not just building a company, Elias. You're building an army. Elias nodded. That's the idea. Back in D.C., the Department of Transportation was drafting the first version of the Vance Clause. Lobbyists fought to dilute it. Airline lawyers tried to insert loopholes, but the language remained firm. For the first time in decades, a major policy initiative born entirely outside of the political establishment was gaining bipartisan support. The public was demanding it, but so too was the backlash forming. On talk radio, Elias was branded the woke emperor of the skies. Op-eds accused him of using social justice as a cudgel for corporate conquest. Political cartoons depicted him as a giant, reshaping airplanes in his hands, with tiny passengers staring up in either adoration or terror. Elias read it all, and he ignored it all. He had no interest in winning a debate. He was too busy re-architecting the system. A new division was formally announced at Nexus Oversight. OES, Operational Equity and Strategy. It was staffed by policy experts, data scientists, cultural anthropologists, and most importantly, survivors. Their mission was not theoretical. It was brutally simple. Prevent another Seat 3A. And yet, not everyone was on board. A powerful trade federation, representing both airline executives and union leaders, gathered for a secret meeting. They weren't just concerned about Elias. They were terrified of the precedent he had set. If he can do this to one of us, a veteran chairman argued, he can do it to all of us. And if passengers begin to expect this level of accountability as the norm, our entire business model is finished. They drafted a multi-pronged counterattack, part public relations, part legal maneuvering, and part outright sabotage. They gave it a code name: Operation Clear Air Turbulence. Meanwhile, Elias, either unaware or simply unconcerned, hosted a private roundtable with the CEOs of the 4 largest airport infrastructure companies in the country. He laid out a blueprint for sweeping architectural reforms, universally inclusive boarding processes, quiet rooms for passengers with sensory sensitivities, and dynamic, multilingual signage. We don't want passengers to simply feel upgraded, he told them. We want them to feel seen. We want them to feel human. It was audacious. It was precise. And it struck fear into the hearts of the old guard, because Elias Vance wasn't just demanding an apology. He was rewriting the definition of the sky itself. The backlash began not with a direct confrontation, but with a series of coordinated whispers. It started with op-eds from retired airline executives, arguing that the industry was being held hostage by social engineering. Cable news shows convened panels to debate whether a private company should have the power to enforce ideological conformity. Social media, once united, began to fracture into opposing camps. Then came the calculated leaks. A series of internal Nexus oversight emails were released anonymously to a conservative news blog. They were innocuous on their own, but when selectively edited and presented out of context, they appeared authoritarian. One headline screamed, "Vance plans mass passenger surveillance system." The document in question was a proposal for a voluntary, privacy-focused app for reporting in-flight incidents. The goal was clear: to plant a seed of doubt. By the end of the week, 4 members of Congress had publicly called for an investigation into Nexus Oversight's unprecedented and unchecked influence. A new catchphrase began to appear in the headlines: "Too much power for one man?" Isabel stormed into Elias's office, holding a tablet displaying a dozen different negative articles. "They are building a narrative against you. It's character assassination by 1,000 paper cuts." Elias remained calm. "It is just noise." "No," she insisted. "It is a story. And stories are what win elections and shape policy." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "Then we will write the next chapter. We will not defend our actions. We will demonstrate their impact." The new plan was formed within an hour. A strategic shift. Nexus Oversight launched Project Dignity Gate, a nationwide initiative to fund and install tangible, measurable improvements in major airports, wider access ramps, real-time translation services at information desks, and new Dignity First boarding protocols designed in consultation with disability advocates. There were no press releases, no grand announcements, just steel, software, and structure. In every airport they upgraded, the passengers noticed. A father whose child had a sensory processing disorder found solace in a newly installed quiet room. An elderly woman who didn't speak English was able to get directions from a new interactive translation screen. A young black man in a sweatshirt was treated with the same respect as a white businessman in a suit. And they talked about it. Online, in person. The stories spread. The opposition was left flailing, trying to find a way to attack an improved wheelchair ramp or a multilingual welcome sign. But they kept trying. A new scandal was manufactured out of thin air. An anonymous whistleblower claimed Nexus Oversight was using its funds to bribe airport officials. Federal investigations were launched. They found nothing. But the process itself was intended to slow them down, to rattle their team. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Isabel asked Elias, "What if they find something? Anything? What if they twist it enough to undo all of this?" Elias didn't hesitate. "Then we will have built something they can never tear down." He pointed to a map on his screen, which showed Nexus Oversight's expansion plans. It no longer focused solely on airlines. It now included hospitals, banks, and municipal court systems, anywhere that human dignity was routinely overlooked. Isabel exhaled slowly. "You're not just fixing an airline anymore, are you?" "No," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm fixing the very lens through which they see us." The reckoning was just beginning. The summons came in a formal, sealed envelope, hand-delivered by a courier from the Department of Justice. It was a federal subpoena for Elias Vance. He read it once, his expression unreadable, then placed it face down on his desk. Isabel stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. "They're not giving up." "They were never going to," Elias replied. "They were just looking for the right battlefield." The battlefield was the court of public opinion, and the weapon was a lawsuit. The charge was that Nexus Oversight was an illegal, unregulated monopoly, using its power to manipulate markets under the guise of ethical reform. The lawsuit was filed by a coalition of airline lobbying groups and powerful private equity firms whose portfolios had been damaged by the Vance mandate. The media went into a frenzy. "Reformer or racketeer?" One headline blared. Another simply asked, "Is this the end of Nexus Oversight?" Elias remained outwardly calm, but Isabel saw a subtle shift in his demeanor. It was not a look of focus, but of cold calculation. They weren't attacking his business model anymore. They were attacking his story. Within 2 days, their support began to waver. 2 of Nexus Oversight's board members resigned, citing pressure from their other corporate affiliations. A major airport improvement contract was indefinitely suspended. Their stock price dipped. Cable news channels ran edited montages of Elias's speeches, cutting them to make him look arrogant and power-hungry. A disgruntled former intern came forward, claiming Elias was a tyrant who silenced internal dissent. It was a textbook character assassination campaign. That night, Isabel stood before the core Nexus Oversight team. Elias was not present. She faced them without notes, her voice clear and strong. "They are trying to rewrite our story. They will lie. They will distort. They will distract. But what they cannot erase is what every single airline passenger now knows they deserve. What they have seen with their own eyes, touched with their own hands. We do not retreat. We reassert." They went back to their work. That same evening, in a community hall in Atlanta, a group of people who had been mistreated by airlines in the past gathered together, unprompted. One woman began to live stream from her phone, holding up a handwritten sign that read, "I sat in seat 3A, and for the first time, I was seen." The video went viral. The hashtag #WeAreSeat3A exploded across social media. We Are Nexus. Thousands of people began to share their own stories, not about Elias, but about the simple human dignity they had been denied. Isabel came into Elias's office, her phone in her hand. "You need to see this." He looked. It was a video from the town hall meeting in Denver. A retired Air Force veteran had stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "They want to smear this man? Let them try. He gave me back a sense of dignity I thought I'd lost forever. No lawsuit is going to erase that." The room had erupted in a standing ovation. Elias said nothing, but for the first time in days, the hardness in his eyes softened. That night, Isabel made a single phone call. The next morning, Elias Vance appeared in public for the first time since the lawsuit was filed. He was not at a press conference. He was not wearing a suit. He was at Chicago O'Hare, Terminal C. Gate 12, the very same gate where his journey had begun. He gave no speech. He simply walked through the terminal, slowly, deliberately. People stopped. They stared. And then a few people started to clap. One by one, other passengers stood up. Gate agents stepped out from behind their counters. Janitors paused with their mops. A river of applause followed him as he walked. He stopped at Gate 12, and then he quietly took a seat. Seat 3A. He said nothing. Isabel posted a single photo from her phone with the caption, "Some seats you fight for. Others, you rebuild." It shattered the internet. The crowd around the gate continued to grow. Passengers from other flights were drawn over by the sound of the applause, by the strange, powerful current of something real and honest happening. Elias just sat there, still. The moment was not staged. It did not need to be. A young girl, no older than 7, walked up to him and placed a drawing in his lap. It was a crayon sketch of an airplane. In the window of seat 3A, she had drawn a smiling face. And on the wing, she had written, "Thank you for making space for us." A flight attendant, one who had not been there on that day, stepped forward, her eyes wet with tears. She bowed her head slightly. "We are all trying to be better because of you, sir." And then a path cleared through the crowd. Greg, the same flight attendant who had pulled Elias from his seat, stood before him. He was not in uniform. He wore civilian clothes, his face pale and gaunt. He looked like a man who had lost everything. "I lost my job," he said, his voice raspy. "My pension, everything. I was angry. I was jealous. I saw you and I just assumed. I didn't see you. I didn't even look." Elias did not get up. He just looked back at him, his gaze steady. "You don't have to forgive me," Greg choked out, "but I had to tell you that I see you now." Elias replied, his voice quiet but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "And you have been seen. That is where we begin." The cameras did not capture that exchange, but the world seemed to feel its impact. Within hours, the lawsuit against Nexus Oversight began to fall apart. 2 of the key plaintiffs publicly withdrew their support, citing a misalignment with public sentiment. The federal investigators announced they had found no merit to the claims, dismissing the case as legally unsound and ethically questionable. It was not just a legal victory. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A month later, Isabel Rios stood on a brightly lit stage at the Nexus Oversight Global Summit. Elias was not there. He was in Detroit, helping to cut the ribbon on the nation's first fully inclusive and accessible regional airport terminal. Isabel faced a diverse audience of investors, regulators, and everyday travelers who had once been invisible. "We are not just building better airports," she said, her voice ringing with confidence. "We are building better expectations. We are not just defending our rights. We are designing a future where those rights are self-evident." She smiled. "So the seat that you are sitting in right now, make it matter. Because someone else is watching and hoping that one day they will be allowed to sit there too." The applause was like rolling thunder. Back in Detroit, Elias stood on the tarmac, his sleeves rolled up, watching a plane take off into the afternoon sky. He did not wave. He did not smile for a camera. He just watched it ascend. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is to let others fly. They say stories like this are fiction. They say men like Elias Vance are not real. Not without some hidden agenda, some fatal flaw. But what if they are wrong? What if the real power was not in his title or his wealth, but in his unwavering silence, his refusal to explain himself to a system that had already judged him? What if Seat 3A became a crucible because one man refused to make himself smaller? There is something deeply unsettling in the image of a man being manhandled, not for any act of aggression, but simply for his quiet presence, because he dared to occupy a space he was not supposed to be in, because the very calmness of his existence was an affront to someone else's definition of order. And there is something truly revolutionary in how Elias responded, not with rage, but with architecture. He did not just demand a seat at the table, he redesigned the entire room. Isn't that the quiet revolution we are all secretly hoping for? Think of the spaces where you have felt invisible, the conversations where your voice was deemed too loud, or too soft, or too different. The seats you were told were not meant for you. Now, imagine what happens when someone decides to change the room itself, instead of asking you to leave. That is what Elias did. He did not demand to be included. He demanded a new design. And in doing so, he sent a clear message to every person who has ever been overlooked. In an airport, in an office, in life, that you are not just worthy of the flight. You are worthy of the ski. So perhaps this was never a story about one CEO. Perhaps it was a story about the quiet war being fought every day in boardrooms and break rooms across the world. About the thousands of tiny indignities that build up into systemic barriers, and about the man who finally drew a line in the sand and then redrew the entire map. The question is no longer whether you would sit in Seat 3A. The question is what you will do when you see someone else being told they cannot. Because in that moment, you are Elias. You are Isabel. You are every person who held up a phone, not for fame, but for evidence. You are every hand that finally clicked send on a report that used to be ignored. This story does not end with a legal victory or a business deal. It ends because a new, better question is being asked. Who truly belongs here? What are we defending when we enforce our policies? And why are we so profoundly threatened by dignity? If this story ignited something in you, anger, sadness, hope, determination, tell us where you are watching from. We want to understand how far this quiet defiance has traveled. If you have ever been told that you are in the wrong seat, the wrong profession, or the wrong story, you are not. You are simply ahead of your time. And perhaps you are the one who is here to help redesign it. Subscribe to Silent Sovereigns, because the next seat to be reclaimed could be your own. And you deserve to be sitting in it. Let us know in the comments what this story meant to you. We will be right here, watching, listening, and sharing the stories that matter. We'll see you in the next one.